Dobro jutro, sredino jutro, morda ste že koga dobro nahecali, 1. april je in humor je v teh trenutkih pomemben, ampak vseeno naj bo jutro prijetno, upam, da ste že pozajtrkovali. Jaz pa bom zdajle pozdravila nekoga v Bruslju in to je Susan Dunger. So I'll just switch to English now and of course you're more than welcome to ask questions in Slovene or in English. Just go to the Q&A session and Susan Dunger, she's an amazing woman. She's a powerful and influential woman, but above all, she's really also emotional. And she's really working hard for the AmCham EU, but also for the AmChams in Europe. I'm so happy that from the January 1st, she's our chairwoman. And with that, I'll just move to Brussels now and say hello, Susan. Just I need you to turn on a mic, Susan. and again, welcome and so happy to have you with us.
Hi, Aisha, sorry about that.
No worries. And just moving to your home in Brussels, Susan, in these times, how are you? It's not easy. I know that you had to basically bring back all your kids from around the world. So first question, more personal, how are you?
Thanks, Aisha, and I'm absolutely delighted, first of all, to be on your Coffee to Connect, and a big hello to all your members as well, and to anyone who's calling in. Thanks for asking how I am. I'm sitting in my house in one of the suburbs of Brussels. The sky is blue and the sun is out. In fact, we've had marvellous weather for the last 10 days. I'm doing okay. We've been on partial confinement, so confinement for the last 2 weeks. Our office has been closed down for 2 weeks. So yeah, I'm here in my house. Normally it had reduced down to just myself and my husband and a dog, and now it's back up to 5 adults. My 3 kids have come back, 1 from Australia and 2 from the north of the UK. So it's a busy house now.
Yeah. Okay, but of course, as I say, the sun is still shining and we want to keep optimism up. And with that, I would maybe start with the questions we want to discuss today, Susan, with you. 3 basic topics. 1, what the EU is doing and how do you feel that this will influence on the business and economy. And of course, we will dive into the transatlantic relationship and how this will change. And at the end, maybe I would really like to ask you also to go back to our members, but also all the others who are watching, how the association as AmChams around the Europe can help. So if starting with the first question, I would go to what exactly do you think is good that EU is now doing, and what should European Commission and the others do in order to bring back the normal life, and what normal life basically will mean after this pandemic?
No, thanks, Aisha. Well, firstly, you know, the first priority in Brussels, as anywhere in Europe at the moment, is health and security of people and public health. And actually, before I even start, I just sort of to put out that from the business point of view and from AmCham EU's point of view is absolutely that, this recognition of it being a tragic health emergency and absolute gratitude to first responders. That in itself is an interesting one, because I think we're seeing as well the definition of who are in the front line changing on a day by day, thanking the first responders, but also now all those others who are involved in the supply chain, taking goods, running shops. There are so many more now out in the front line. So I think that that's also just an interesting trend from the point of view of who we're expressing our gratitude to. But in point of view of EU perhaps, and the response, I mean, it's definitely in crisis mode. I would say from the point of view of, if we take whether it's the European Commission and the Parliament and all the institutions, and whether we take everyone else involved in that Brussels bubble circle business, it's pretty much 100% crisis mode, crisis response. In that respect, you know, let's take the EU piece first. How is the EU managing? Obviously, they have also the very practical difficulties that we all have, which is the closure of their buildings and institutions, and how they are actually just physically having discussions and meetings. And we're seeing, you know, finance ministers on WebEx and other fora trying to make such important decisions. The challenges involved have been, firstly, which has been the worry, is this potential fragmentation Obviously, the member states have certain competencies which they will continue to have, but there has been, the first challenge has been how to react to countries, whether it be Slovenia or Croatia, closing in, doing their own thing, closing down borders. So one of the first responses that the EU has had to take is to really try to speak out on keeping borders open. They introduced green lanes, for example, but also to try and emphasize again the importance, not so much the single market for the sake of the single market in the old days, but the importance of the EU remaining with a spirit of solidarity. Keep everything open, work together, be coordinated. So, I mean, I could stop there if you like. That's the first challenge.
So, Susan, do you feel that EU and who in the EU is doing that? Is there somebody who is really calling up? Because maybe sometimes back in our countries, we don't hear that enough. And even people in the country are more basically inward looking and looking what is happening now, let's say in Slovenia. How do we feel? How we'll fight this? And we don't hear Brussels' voice that much. And who basically is doing that, and are they doing it good?
That is a really interesting question. I think it's really important for us to hear that perspective from you, actually, of what the sense is in Slovenia. Well, one example is that President von der Leyen, the President of the Commission, speaks out daily. I think, I don't necessarily, have the opportunity to listen to her daily, but I think that's been very well received. She's very hands-on, gives an update daily. So maybe what we can do is try and find the link to that and send that through so you can share that with your members. I think one of the challenges also, of course, in the EU is inevitably the language barrier of what language, how to communicate with regard to what's happening in the EU with 27 countries, which is a challenge. And we've flagged that up actually in terms of supporting the Commission in their efforts. And, they tend to be heavily criticised always. It's a natural thing that happens in Europe. Hey, let's criticise the EU. And on that front, I would say we feel that they are doing their very best to coordinate. It may not be perfect, but they're making a really good effort. And I think from the point of view of the business community as well, we should be supportive of that. This is not the time to come out and be overly critical. Let's assume positive intent and encourage them in that coordination. So they are, who should you listen out to? You should listen out there. I would also encourage anyone to, just on a very practical level, look at the European Commission website, where they give daily updates of their responses, including importantly, the economic responses, which we can maybe get to.
At this point, I'll invite our viewers to write us questions or even comments, but would like to go back to your point of open borders and green lines. Maybe if you can elaborate on that. Green lines is basically something that is coming up now, and maybe even in our countries, we are not aware enough that we should, as business, also support that, because at the end of the day, it is important for the health, but also for the business.
Yes, I mean, I think indeed, Aisha, this is a really important area. So it stems just again from this, we've got to focus on maintaining the single market and keeping industry going. And I think what's interesting being in Brussels, and the further we get into this crisis, first of all, even the reaction possibly from Amcham EU was, hey, hang on, is this really a priority to talk about having the borders open, and is this just again the view of the private sector, and they're not thinking at all about public health? The further you go into it, you realize how critical it is, yes, for medical equipment across medical supplies. Then you get into the raw materials required for making those medical equipments. Then you get into, okay, because I heard that on the news this morning, they're running out of the raw materials to make the testing kits. These need to cross the borders. Then you need the packaging, you need the printing, so that these packaging for the testing kits can be done. Then you need the food, you need essential workers who are perhaps crossing borders to repair essential infrastructure, energy, oil, all those things that we just take for granted on a daily basis. You need people to cross. So the green lanes. So green lanes were introduced on the 23rd of March, and the aim is to ensure these EU-wide supply chains in every possible regard of essential services. So basically, member states need to designate relevant internal border crossings on trans-European transport network as a green lane border crossing, and these have to be open to all freight vehicles, whatever goods they're carrying. It's designed to ensure that no border crossing will take more than 15 minutes. So it's tried to speed it all up. And member states are also urged to temporarily suspend all road access restrictions currently in place in their territory, such as whether it's weekends, nights, and sectoral basis. So the real aim is to speed it up and ensure that goods can cross quickly and they're not stopped.
Susan, do we see any of the countries that are basically against that? Because we hear for some companies that, let's say, they have a big warehouses in Poland, and they're afraid that it will be impossible to get things as medical supplies from there, even if it's not directly connected with pandemic. So we see that now many countries are thinking to really close the borders for the specific medical supplies, but it includes not only the respirators and that, but also the other medical supply. So it can basically create a big problem for the countries, but also to the companies.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, Aisha. I think the danger here is, I think that's first of all the initial reaction that countries have, and don't get me wrong, I'm not an expert on this, is we need to lock down, we need to protect our citizens, we need to protect our country. And that was the first reaction. And then as you go forward, like I said, when you realize how intricate the supply chains are, there is a danger if those countries shut down, they will find they don't have what they need, they can't produce what they need because they need the materials from elsewhere, and they're going to be in a worse situation. So I think very much the message from business and for our companies is very much sharing. This is the time absolutely for national solidarity, European solidarity, but also it goes further than that, it goes to global solidarity. We're seeing that even, and we're probably going to come on to that, even freight routes across the Atlantic. The pharmaceutical industry is really concerned that that stays open because we just have never understood the complexity of who's needing what from where. I understand it a bit from the whole Brexit debate. I have to say, we never understood how many times things cross borders, 6 to 20 times before a final good's made. I think this is the essential to tell countries, look into that first, and all our companies want those borders to stay open. It's vital for the private sector too.
We will focus on transatlantic a bit later, but I would like now to turn to China and maybe discuss a bit this. Do you have feeling that in these times Europe basically is more leaning to China than to our biggest trade partner and investment partner, US? So do we see now the shift is happening?
You know, this is a controversial topic and an interesting one. I think what we're seeing and what we're seeing talked about is that China now slowly, supposedly emerging from the critical point of its crisis, is now helping, and it has always been helping, as my understanding, in terms of expertise during even when they were in crisis. And the term soft power is being used in Brussels. Clever soft power of the Chinese, offering help, being overly helpful to try and ensure that they are already building up their relationship with Europe for when this crisis may eventually be over. Saying that, there is still a considerable degree of suspicion, so it depends who you talk to, but I think it will play into our discussion on EU-US eventually, which is the feeling is that if there's been a lack of leadership from the US side in not helping, then yeah, countries are in need here. Of course, they're going to turn to China or to anyone who can help. So I think we're going to see this as a big topic of further discussion going forward, Aisha.
And here we have a question from our viewer. How do you think, Susan, that basically the EU functioning will change after this pandemic? Will there be many changes in your opinion?
I think it won't be business as usual. I think already you're seeing unfortunately some splits in terms of the approach to how to deal with the crisis, and we're trying to push back on that. The most important thing is to remain solidaire, as you'd say in French. I don't think it will be as usual because some of the legislation, for example, some of the regulation that's been putting into place, already we're saying, hey, put this on hold, or put a break on it at the moment. Plus, the way we will look at it going forward is that it will have to have a completely new angle to it. So any proposals, be it the Green Deal, be it industrial strategy, it can't just remain as it was. It's going to have a totally different perspective because we're going to have to rebuild the economy. So in that respect, there'll have to be a different view on how we handle the work coming out of the EU. I would like to think in terms of how the EU works, they will have a different mindset. I hope very much it will continue to function in principle as it has done before, because we don't want it to break up. So it'll just be a different mindset that is definitely required. And again, I would encourage also from the Slovenian level as well at the moment, there is a bit of a split at the moment of how we approach the financial measures that are being put into place. And you can see the northern countries taking a different approach to some of the southern countries. And I would encourage from your level just to continue to create the spirit of cooperation.
Mm-hmm. And it's really important to say what we are basically knowing, but maybe sometimes not emphasizing enough, that it's so important how we'll react and what we'll do now also for the times to come that will be more positive. And with this, I would like to ask Jože send us a question, and he basically asked, how do you think will the pandemic affect the business in Europe and how low we will fall?
Sorry, could you repeat that question, Aisha?
Yeah, so how do you think will the pandemic affect the business in Europe and how low we will fall?
Yeah, we say that's the pandemic that we talk about here. You know, I'm on a personal level, I'm also looking at the statistics, but trying not to get too depressed by them. But certainly, it would seem that we're still 2 weeks off the peak. I don't know about Slovenia, being British and being in Northern Europe and in Brussels, that we're still not even there yet. I think we're going to fall much more low. You can see now in the larger countries, I don't know about Slovenia, the construction of hospitals in major conference centers, the capacity really being ramped up. We're looking at least another 2 weeks before the peak, but I'm not the expert on this. I'm going what I hear. We're also hearing, just from the point of the shutdown in Brussels, we're talking about 19th of April, 3rd of May. So that gives an extent. I think from the health point of view, we're going to fall lower. The economy, again, from the economic standpoint, there is also real concern. If you talk to any businesses in Brussels, I talk to a lot of other associations, sectoral associations, the CEOs there are really concerned about the impact on the economy. And I think the important thing is that the impact on the smaller businesses as well. There's this feeling, well, okay, the bigger businesses probably amongst our members, but not only. I know you have many small businesses in your membership, Aisha. The big businesses, yeah, they'll probably pull out of this. They're going to manage, but it's really the impact on the smaller businesses, and that is like 95% of employment. It's huge.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the sectoral associations. What exactly do you think they're doing good right now in Europe? And how maybe our, if we go back to Slovenia, our sectoral or even national associations should work, because at the end of the day, the directives and the measures that will be coming out of Europe are important also for national states.
Yeah, no, actually, I think it's really important to work with the sectoral associations. We have, just so you know, on a very practical level, once a quarter in normal times, a luncheon with 12, 13 of these sectoral association heads where I'm sharing and best practice on different challenges. And in these times of crisis, we've had a first call last Friday that was put together. And some of what's coming out of them, for example, you have their FPA, it's the Pharmaceutical Association. You have CEFIC, it's the Chemicals Association. I think some of the big concerns coming up from them, or what they're doing, firstly, is they are on the phone, some definitely on a weekly basis, some on a daily basis with the European Commission. So you can rest assured in Slovenia that there is daily, weekly contact with the industry leaders from different sectors with the relevant commissioners, primarily, as you can imagine, from the pharmaceutical industry, of how can business help, how can they get these supplies through. But I think also it creates a much better understanding of the detail of this, like I said, on the raw materials crossing, or for example, the chemicals industry. We're already seeing drop in the oil price, demand going down. What happens if refineries close? Think about the needs. I open my eyes to think about the chemicals that we need in all different aspects of our life. And if they're not being produced, we have a problem. Water, waste, and so forth. So I think just from the point of view of understanding the situation, it's good to work with them, plus potentially joint statements. This is also very powerful to work with the sectorals to when it's necessary, not for the sake of it, to do a joint statement and speak out together with others and on this. Maybe I'll stop there on that, Aisha.
And here it's another question that we got, and I wish you would have a magic ball and pink glasses on. And the question is, what is your prediction for the world economy? How long it will take for us to get back on the feet?
You know, I'm not an economist, Aisha. However, what is my prediction? I would say, how long did it take us to get out of the 2008 crisis? I'm not sure what the economists would say. Some countries are maybe not yet out of it. It took some countries a long time. So that's already 10, 11 years ago. They are saying that this crisis will be worse than that. So we're talking, you know, we're talking long term. We're talking 5 to 10 years probably, as we're seeing not only for Europe. I think the important thing here is to recognize this is not just about Europe. Again, it goes back to the global supply chains. We are so global, we need everyone. So we need to stand together to have everyone pick up. China, including China, everyone's saying, oh yeah, they're picking up again. I think it's a bit misleading in that they also have estimates of GDP growth, which are very, very small. And China relies on Europe doing as well. We buy their goods. So I haven't answered your guest's question because I wouldn't want to put a number on it, but I think we're talking 5-10 years.
Whoa, I said pink glasses and magic balls, Susan, so I'll just ignore the last answer. But anyway, as you're all the time saying, we need to stay open, we need to stay solidaire. And one thing that we have another question, and also the comment that we see that basically countries are dealing with the COVID issue one by one, and that we don't feel the united voice. So you said that in Brussels, there is a feeling that there is a united one voice, but basically probably back in the national states, the feeling is not there. So maybe here, if we can go back to that, and what should maybe even us in the national states do to ask EU, let's try to be more united in this.
No, I hear you, and I hear your guests, Aisha, and it is indeed a criticism as well. And including when I spoke to my association colleagues from the different sectors, some of them indeed expressed that concern. Where is the coordination? Where is the voice? So it's not perfect indeed. At the same time, as I said, the point was made, we need to support and not criticize. However, what I can certainly do from the Brussels side, I will take that back. That's something I can personally do, is to say, I've heard from the countries that they're lacking this voice. And maybe we need to think of ways together of getting that voice out. I think what Slovenia could do is exactly that, is say perhaps whether it's via your Slovenian commissioner as a first step, whether it's via your Slovenian MEPs who can continue to put across those messages. You could write, I'm sure you could write and say, we support you, we agree with what you're doing, however, we would like to hear more from you, but I would suggest in a very constructive way. It can always help. But certainly, I think there's a danger people complain. I think it's a European thing. We like to sit back and complain, but we need to be the ones doing things as well and helping, which I know AmCham Slovenia is doing.
And here, maybe now it's time really to explain a bit more what AmChams in Europe are doing. I'm really proud that Slovenia is now the seat of the 43 countries united. We are more connected than ever. And with your leadership, Susan, as you're taking over the chairwoman position, we even feel more empowered by each other. But what we can, as a network of 43 countries, we have 45 AmChams within there, what we can do jointly and what are the things that we want to achieve, because you said you should write, and probably here also AmChams can have a role and can help, which is important.
So I think, yes, indeed. I mean, Aisha, you and I know that never before has our network been more united. And so your guests know the AmChams Europe network consists of these 44 AmChams in 43 countries across Europe and Eurasia. So it's not specifically by any means anything to do with the EU. And I think what this network can do, there are two things that we've identified, well, two main things that we've identified that we can do. One is the best practice sharing. So from the point of view of actually the leaders of all these AmChams getting together, we've done maybe 3 or 4 calls in the last 2 weeks, perhaps more. We've done 1 already this week, 2 last week, 1 the week before, so that's more. Sharing best practice on anything from the practicalities of how we can service our members, how we can engage with members, how we can serve you, the members who are listening to this, which has been really useful. I think we can really show our value. We've been sharing best practice on actually from the point of view of ourselves being small businesses, which is probably relevant for many of your members as well being small businesses, is budgets. How are we managing the budgets? How are we thinking about just keeping our own organizations going? We've also talked about government responses. How are we engaging with government? So I think the network itself can really help by bringing perhaps expertise from some chambers who are more advanced and others who just lack the resources to feed off these ideas so we could all be more effective. So there's that best practice piece. There's the other bit linked to that, which is just being together. And I go back to my solidarity word. It has never been more important to work together and be united. Then the second bit, Aisha, would be what can we say? And you and I know we're working on that. And AmCham, my team in Brussels, volunteered, and we've been putting together a statement, simple, we hope something that everybody can agree on with regard to let's focus on the essential, maintaining the single market as far as the EU is concerned, keeping borders open as far as wider Europe and Eurasia is concerned, ensuring that supply chains can continue, ensuring that we're coordinated in order that we can cope with this crisis, mitigate the crisis, come over it, and also put in place, importantly, start working on the economic measures that are going to be needed to survive this and to hopefully not have it last 5 to 10 years, but for us to get through this more quickly. So the network itself is proving really valuable for that. And we hope to come out with that statement, I hope, Aisha, this week, that can be translated into many languages and all the chambers around Europe and Eurasia can use it then in their own countries.
And it really makes us all proud that this network is also helping back in the countries with basically dealing with the current crisis. They're helping with all different things, having coordinations for getting supply to the government. So I really think that this network can bring a lot to Europe. And sometimes, you know, when we are saying AmChams, of course, many people think that we are an American association, but let's be honest, we are a European association. But of course, our important mission is also to have a good transatlantic relationship. And with that, I would like to ask you, Susan, we already mentioned a bit that the relationship probably is now challenged more than ever. But still, it is an important relationship between Europe and US. So maybe comment a bit on this. And you also have the fresh data for the transatlantic survey that you are doing every year with Joe Quinlan and the others authors, and how this is important in the perspective of the current situation.
Yeah, indeed, Aisha, where to start? I think on that, we should never forget that the EU, the transatlantic relationship is vital. It's the sort of driver of the world economy. I think we sometimes move into this narrative that China is the most important relationship. Any trade relationship with China is the most important. I think, I refer back to one analogy that was made last week when we launched the Transatlantic Economy 2020 survey that you referred to, Aisha. This comment was made by one of the authors when he presented it, and he alluded to the relationship between the EU and the US as like an 8-lane highway, and he compared the relationship with China as a 2-lane highway. And then he said, try and imagine, okay, if you close down the 2-lane highway, okay, there's a bit of a bottleneck, but on the whole, it's probably not too bad, a few delays and so forth. And then he said, imagine closing down an 8-lane highway. This is major disruption. And I think we have to remember how important that relationship with the US is economically. And that also to remember, which is something we have been struggling with, perhaps a bit more so in the last few years, if we're honest, there are challenges with the rhetoric that has come out from the current US administration. And we're struggling just to make sure that we continue with the messaging of that we're friends and allies. We have such common values, we have common history more than anywhere in the world between, and I say the EU, between Europe and the US. And we need to emphasize this even more than ever before. I believe that coming out of this crisis, this could be a point that perhaps the US as well, which is itself has had a temptation in this crisis, we're hearing the news, to block themselves off. They came out with some very sharp, perhaps not done the best way in the communications term of shutting down borders, stopping those from the Schengen coming into the US very quickly. It didn't go down well over here too well in the way it was handled. And even, unfortunately, some stories that have emerged about flying in to get equipment secretly from Europe to take back to the US. You know, these stories do not help. We all need to work on that, to say we need to stay together on this. I think the US will also realize, again, because of my points on the global supply chain, that they need to keep the borders open. They need us to continue this flow, to continue during this crisis, and maybe it'll be a shift afterwards. I think something that will happen, and which we're going to have to watch, is the possible tendency now that everyone is already saying, hey, we need to produce more in our own country, we need to do more in Europe, we'll need to bring production back to the US. There could be some truth in that, but at the same time, we certainly don't want protectionism and nationalism to grow. I'll stop there for a minute, Aisha.
No, but thank you for this point. So important, and we should put it on repeat and listen again, and then of course try to convey them also to the other side of Atlantic. And let's be honest, we have their partners who want to really say these things, but not only say these things, but also do in this way. But before we go more deep into the transatlantic economy relationship, the question from our viewers is, how do you think, Susan, US reacted to the COVID-19 and how hard they will be affected?
So obviously, actually a good point to make actually is that AmCham EU is totally apolitical. I just like to say that we don't align with any particular administration, and therefore we work very closely with the US mission in Brussels and have a great relationship with them and share all the time. How did whether it's my place to react and how did the US react? It would seem, my personal view would be that they reacted slowly, potentially did not react quickly enough, but you could also argue that that was the same with many countries in Europe as well. I think there was possibly some denial that how can this crisis impact well-functioning liberal democracies who were also well run, and I think there was possibly a bit of complacency not only in the US but in other countries, and we're seeing that now. I'm trying to learn from Italy, who said, hey, don't be like us, get in there quick and lock down. So I think the US they denied it for a while. I think what we're seeing is a huge turnaround in the last few days, even hours, that President Trump himself has gone from saying, hey, we're going to be open again by Easter. I'm sure you've all heard this, but perhaps not. He said we're going to be open again by Easter. A lot of people said this is completely unrealistic, and now there's a bit of turnaround. There is, I believe now, a recognition, hey, this is a serious crisis. The US has more deaths, I believe now, than more cases than China has had. It's going to be critical in the US. And they have the problem, this is again one of the big subjects, which is interesting, is that autocracies, personally, I'm not into the autocratic regimes as a personal view, but the advantage they have is the discipline that they're able to exert on citizens and on their countries in terms of the lockdowns. And the challenge that any liberal democracy has is that they're not able to do this so well. So the spread is going to be greater, and it's possibly going to take longer to overcome.
But on this, I also think it's so important that we don't lose our values. So this is something that AmCham Slovenia is repeating, that all the values that we have, and at the end of the day, the democracy that we manage in Europe to have is so important, and that we should not only trade it. Of course, it's important to have safety, but let's please not forget about the values that we also have. So with that, I completely agree with you, Susan. So if we go now to this business relationship and partnership, there are many lanes, as you said, the 8 lane or even more in this relationship. So if we are talking about trade and goods, we are the #1 partners with US. If we are talking about investment as well, EU and Europe and US are so importantly connected. Even in Slovenia, US are the 3rd largest investor. And then when we talk services, again, is the same thing. And of course, when we are talking digital, we all move now to the digital life. And without big companies from US, basically, this would be impossible. So can you comment a bit about how this was before the COVID, and what are the numbers, so we can really see why it is so paramount importance, and then what do you think will happen after we'll come out?
Yes, I mean, some of the numbers, Aisha, I mean, the big numbers on, I mean, perhaps pre-COVID, the message we've always given about the transatlantic relationship has been, it's not just about trade. Actually, it's more about investment. And you may remember the attempt to form a transatlantic trade and investment partnership called, better known as TTIP, a number of years ago, which went cold and froze and now is dead. But it was very important that the word investment was in that, to show that it was not about trade. Trade in goods is one part of it. Trade in services actually is the huge part of it, and I can come back to that maybe because this is part of the debate. But to give you one figure on investment, which comes from the study, 50% of global investment into the US comes from Europe, and 61% of US global investment goes to Europe. So just those 2 figures themselves emphasize the importance of this overall relationship. And I know you can delve deeper into the figures about Slovenia. The other figure I always like to quote is that this is more when we try to do our bit to really continue to emphasize the importance of this relationship, is that 56% of the profits of US companies globally, so this is not including the US, so US companies globally, their profits, 56% comes from Europe. So it's a really important figure to emphasize the absolute importance of the relationship. And we continue to try and convey that particular figure on the other side of the Atlantic. But perhaps just delving into the services and the goods that you mentioned, it's true to say this is the controversial topic about with the current US administration trying to rectify the trade deficit, and they have a distinct focus on goods. And it's true to say that the US trade deficit in goods is a negative one, in that Europe is exporting more goods than the other way around. But on services, it's the opposite. In services, the US is exporting huge amount of services to Europe. It still means the overall deficit is still in Europe's favor, but you have to see all these things through a different lens, and ultimately it's about recognizing the profits that those US companies are making over here. It's about the investment opportunities, and that balanced out still means that both sides are benefiting and both sides are thriving together. And still, yeah, maybe I'll stop there for a minute, Aisha.
And jobs, one thing that will be more than ever important now in these times or after the crisis will be jobs, because we can see that there are many job loss already announced, and people will basically need jobs. So in regard of jobs, this is also an important figure that we can mention.
Yeah, indeed. So I give you actually the top line figures that come, and I'd encourage you to look at these figures. One is that in this relationship, there are 16 million jobs which are supported by the transatlantic relationship on both sides of the Atlantic. It's about the same in terms of direct jobs. I think the latest figure is 4.6 million direct jobs in Europe further to the relationship, and about 4.7 or 8 on the other side. The other figures maybe of note are the transatlantic relationship contributes, it basically is half of total global personal consumption. And if we think about personal consumption, this is what drives the economy, so it's massive. And I will give you two more figures. The other figure is there are $5.6 trillion in total commercial sales a year. And I always find it difficult getting into billions and trillions. And even President Trump made a mistake the other day in his billions and trillions. So it's a difficult one. But $5.6 trillion. And the final figure is the transatlantic relationship it contributes 1/3 of global GDP. So it is still massive. Now this, admittedly, some of these figures were put together pre-COVID, but the authors would say it's incredible. As I said when we presented this, in the 15 years or almost 20 years now that we've been doing this study, it's consistent of how important this relationship is.
And we should really not forget about it. One thing that we got the question is why USA closed borders with Europe and remain it open with UK?
Huh?
You being from UK,
yeah,
inside view.
That's a good question. When I heard that announcement myself, I was like flabbergasted because it seemed to be, I don't think their PR was great. I don't think their public relations on this was great. I don't think their communication was great in that and I addressed this with, I don't know why they did it. It certainly looked like it was favouring the UK because of supposedly the special relationship, supposedly because they want to get their US-UK deal done. However, delving into it a little bit more, I addressed this with the US mission, it wasn't apparently meant to be like that. It was literally Schengen area where, because at that point in time, certainly the virus seemed to be most prevalent because of it's being at that point in Italy and Spain. And at that point, it wasn't so much in the UK, but I think they came in almost the day after and also put the same limits on Ireland and the UK. Saying that as a Brit, people do tend to forget that there is the element that Ireland and the UK are islands. So there is actually a fundamental difference there. People always laugh at that, but it actually does make a difference. It's very easy to close down the borders for my country. You just shut it down straight away. No one can get in.
That's true. So with that, Susan, I would really like to thank you for today, but also like to thank you for the leadership for the AmChams in Europe that you are conveying to all of us, and especially for the solidarity that you're always putting in first. And I'm certain that in the broader Europe will try to help to Europe, but also to convey the message of why transatlantic matters. Thank you so much, Susan. And thanks to all of our members and members that are supporters, all of them, but especially to the patron members. Without you, it would be impossible to work whatever good we do. And tomorrow we'll talk about what kind of scenarios are there. Our guests will be torej z nami bosta Branko Žibret, Ejti Kearney in Matej Potokar Lanikom. Veselim se vas jutri ob 10. Še enkrat, thank you to Brussels.
Thank you very much to you. Thank you.